Everybody. My name's Jeff Mulligan, so I'm from the UK, scaffolding instructor from there for a while, so I'll just tell you a little bit about me. But as we know, Joe's invited me today to talk about the hazards from dropped objects in the scaffolding industry. These are the consequences of dropping something or having an item fall, such as scaffold materials, which includes fittings, tubes, boards. All of these can be accidentally dropped or allowed to fall from scaffolding if it's left unattended, as well as tools being dropped through misuse or overreaching. Personally, I've worked in the scaffolding industry since 1980, so 41 years, and I've seen major development with regards to safety due to changes in legislation and best practice methods of work. In 2004, I became a CISRS scaffolding instructor, providing all levels of training. And ultimately, I went on to manage a major training centre in the UK. 3 years ago, I was invited to come out to Malaysia and open the first UK international scaffold training centre. This now provides the opportunity to train locally based scaffold companies to the same high standards followed in the UK and by much of the oil and gas industry throughout the Middle East. The training and certification has an emphasis on the working at height regulations and the use of safety guidance, providing mandatory training for all aspects of falls, and that covers both personnel and dropped objects. Within the working at height regulations, section 10 covers the prevention of falling items, and section 11 covers the provision of danger areas. I think the big difference for the UK and Asia is in the United Kingdom, working at height is a legal requirement. Unfortunately, it's still difficult to estimate the actual number of incidents that are related to dropped objects from scaffolding, as many do go unrecorded or are listed under other headings, such as struck by, or they often just go completely unrecorded if no injury occurs. The truth is, in the majority of cases, we still get lucky, even though they should be recorded as a near miss. However, the National Access and Scaffolding Confederation, who are the leading trade association for the UK, recognise this hazard as the leading risk to injury after falls from height. I'm going to get Joe to pop up a question on the screen, and I would like everybody to vote on this poll. So the question says, and above, what height must we consider the risk of falling objects? So if everybody can pick one of those items. So we're looking at how we control the risk of falling objects, so edge protection. And from scaffolding, this can be more than just handrails. It can be toe boards, upstands. It covers protection fans, the use of covered walkways, fencing, exclusion zones, road closures, safe alternate routes, and of course, warning signs. Zylan, do we have any questions on the Q&A that you want to ask me at this point?
We have 3 questions at the moment. One related to drop zone calculations. Then the second question is related to secondary protections, which related to the parameters, but I believe that we can discuss the answer at the end of the session.
Maybe because there is stuff I want to talk about where we look at look at just that. So all right, I think we've given it enough time for everybody to cast their vote. So Joe, what was the overall? So 4% of people have said platforms over 3 meters. Well, in Malaysia, under the Factories and Machinery Health, Safety and Welfare Regulation, that states 10 meters. BAWAC regulation, 10 feet, it states. BAWAC regulations, the Factories and Machinery Act in Malaysia states 3 meters. In Australia and Singapore, it states 2 meters. So that's true as well. The United States, they still say 10 feet in OSHA regs. So even that 1% of people, if they're working in America, is correct. 67%. So the majority have said all platforms where a fall can occur. And if you're working in England, then that's the right answer. If you're following the working at height regulations, that's the right answer. So I threw that question out there because there's not really a right answer. It depends where you're working, because different countries have different legislations. So obviously our job is to make sure we're in compliance with local legislation, and really the best thing we should be complying with is best practice, which in my view 67% have got correct when you've all jumped on anywhere that a fall can occur. In the working at height regulations, it actually says it's any height liable to cause distance, to cause injury. Even if it's under 1 meter, the law demands that protection is put in place unless a suitable risk assessment can show otherwise. Zylan, can we flip to the next slide? So this slide, I think this picture speaks 1,000 words, really. As a trainer, I find the biggest challenge to promoting safety is convincing people that they need to change. And I'm sure everybody listening today has their own opinions on safety. A human factor, or the human factor, has 3 main areas of influence, being attitude, the first one. So attitude is how someone feels about something. So attitudes can be positive or negative, and it's something that can be learnt from peers or employees over time. And this can become a strong belief once it's been ingrained. It will also have a big impact on someone's respect for safety. As a trainer, I often hear comments from reluctant learners where I get things said to me such as, "We've never had an accident yet. I've always done it like this. What are the chances of it happening to me? And this is how I was taught to do it." So people's attitude has a big influence. The second area we need to look at is aptitude. So that's someone's personal ability to do something well or badly. As a manager or supervisor, I believe it's very important for us to consider when we're placing a person in a position that they will have influence over others, that they actually have a good attitude and a good ability. New starters and trainees will learn a lot by emulating or copying what they see and hear. And then the third and final area is motivation. This is the driving force for learning new methods of work or using the latest equipment, which in turn may require training. This can be encouraged by reward or recognition, such as monetary rewards or certifications, both of which go a long way. In the image that we're showing here, this shows a complete disregard of safety by scaffolders, not only for their own personal safety, but also the safety of others. It shows unattended material left stood up on elevated work platforms, and all of this work is being carried out over and above pedestrians and offering zero in the way of protection of the public. The type of yellow barrier that's shown at street level is not sufficient. These are actually no better than having warning tape up. Physical barriers such as fencing should be provided with clear warning signs. Also, a safe alternate route must be provided, and this must achieve and maintain a safe distance from any danger area, and that needs to be maintained throughout the erection or dismantle of the scaffold. Zylan, can we go to the next slide?
Sure.
These are headlines for all the wrong reasons. So in 2015, a major incident occurred in London, which involved a dropped object falling from scaffolding in the city of London. It was recorded on CCTV, and it happened on a busy road in the central city area. The scaffolders were actually working over the public when a large scaffold tube fell from a high level. As it fell, the tube was deflected and it travelled across a busy road, and it ended up striking 2 female pedestrians aged 53 and 72. Both women were actually on the other side of the road on a public footpath when they were hit, and both suffered severe head injuries and were rushed to hospital. The scaffolder that was in charge of the job, he was arrested by police on site, and then he was held in a police station under the suspicion of causing grievous bodily harm and failure to comply with the Working at Height Regs 2005 and the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. He was held overnight before eventually being released on bail, although he was not charged in the end, as the investigation by the HSE and the police both found that the company he was employed by and himself had taken what they deemed reasonably sufficient and practical steps, as they had installed a protected walkway directly under the area. But no one had actually thought about what could happen on the other side of the road. So my next poll question, just to keep everybody awake, how do you think such an incident could be prevented? So again, look at the options. I mean, the investigation found the scaffolder wasn't held responsible. They deemed that the covered walkway that he had installed was sufficient. But I think this relates to the questions, Ireland, that you're asking about the perimeters and the distances. And for me to answer that question already at this point, if a scaffold tube or a fitting falls through scaffolding, it can hit a brace or a ledger or a tube, and it can be deflected. And then where it goes, it's like a pinball machine. And the higher up you are, the further the item can be deflected out. So I don't know of any specific equation that you can measure the distance directly out or left or right. Again, it depends on windy days for items like wooden boards or large items that are dropped or fall from scaffolding. So all of this needs to be looked at. So Joe, if we can put the answers up, what have the majority of people said at this point?
Yeah, so we still get a few more questions in, but I think we have a clear result.
I mean,
So
when this accident happened, I was in Dubai. I wasn't even in London, and I read it on the internet on the day the accident happened. So bad news like this spreads fast. You can see in the image on the right-hand side the size of the scaffold tube. It was about a 2.5 meter tube, and say hitting two women around the head, then it's going to cause serious injury, and it did. I wasn't involved in the investigation or the accident at all, so I don't know what the outcome to the two women was at the end of the day. But all I know is that, as it was shown on the pictures, the ambulance picked them both up and rushed them off to hospital for care. So looking at the answers, 80% of people have said conduct a risk assessment, and I would agree with that 100%. So as far as conducting a risk assessment on something like this goes, what kind of things could we have put in place? Well, the scaffolders could have closed the road off. In London, to close a road, and I believe this probably happens in most countries, to close a road, you have to get in touch with the local authorities, and then they usually require a fee to be paid in advance to shut the road. So from my experiences, work such as this would be done out of hours. So the road would be closed at night when the traffic is at low level, and obviously the cost of closure is a lot less. But the road is closed, and then that would stop people or traffic coming down the road, making it safe. Some people say they could install a protection fan, but if you look at the size of that tube and imagine that falling vertically, that would probably punch straight through a set of boards anyway. So the boards probably wouldn't have a great deal of effect if that was to fall from anything more than 6 meters. Supervising the work would be a basis really at the beginning that I would say all jobs should be supervised. Temporary works measures covers high risk work, and something over the public like this would probably come under temporary work, so BS 5975, and then that would equate for the need to provide temporary works coordinators, temporary works supervisors, and then those two people would be responsible for planning for the protection of the public or anybody from dropped objects. In temporary works, coordinators and supervisors would be held accountable to ensure legislations are followed. Zylan, can we flop to the next slide, please? So I would say the best tool for scaffolding is foresight, but unfortunately scaffolding comes with its inherent risks, such as the risks of slipping, falling from, and dropped objects. It is important that we are aware of these hazards and we take steps to mitigate them or reduce them as soon as is practically possible. The NASC have produced a safety guidance book. It's called SG4, and this is the safety guidance for scaffold training, and it's backed by the HSE in the UK and all major health and safety bodies. This identifies that the risk from loose tubes and equipment that are left on scaffolds unattended become an unacceptably unsafe hazard, leading to potential injuries. Loose tubes and unsecured decks can become major hazards in the event of moderate or high winds. System scaffolds can reduce the risk of dropped objects with reduction in number of components. This reduces the needs for the components by integrating these and removing the need for loose fittings. In all cases, housekeeping must be performed and monitored. SG 415, which is the latest edition, considers the teaching of safe methods of work and the use of supervision and inspection as a standard requirement for all jobs. SG4 was first released in the year 2000, and every 5 years it gets reviewed. So it was due for review in 2020, but since COVID struck, it was delayed, and now it's being pushed back even further. So I believe it's being planned for release next year as the updated version. SG4 considers 3 main stages of scaffolding. This being the erection phase, where there's a temptation for scaffolders to overload materials or store loose items. A user phase, where the client becomes responsible for the scaffold after the completion. And this is where scaffolds must be inspected periodically to ensure that the condition of the working platform is suitable for use. And it's inspected to ensure that it's not overloaded and that there is no storage of loose items or removal of edge protection. And then lastly, the removal or striking phase. Here there's a high risk of loose items being dropped or thrown, and therefore supervision will ensure the removal of items are carried out in the correct sequence to ensure safe methods of work are followed. As we've said, the supervisor's job is then to accept full responsibility for the actions of all those people under his control. So every job now becomes self-monitoring and self-controlling. Zylan, can we have the next slide?
Sure. Sorry, Job, but since you talk about this topic, there's a question highlighted on tubular, modular, and frame. Which one is safer? And well, since you talk about this topic, maybe you can highlight some of the answers down there already.
With tubular, with tubular, to be honest, working at height is the same whether you're using system, whether you're using tube and coupler, whether you're using frames. Basically, it's somebody should be doing a risk assessment. So the foresight, as we said, this is the most important tool. Planning for any event, no matter how unlikely it must seem, and then the dropping of objects, which is what we're talking about today. Obviously, tube and coupler, you've got more components, so the greater the risk. With frames, the problem with frames is there's no way really of protecting the person installing it. You can't put an advanced guardrail in place. You can't put toe boards in place to prevent items being kicked or dropped. From what I've seen with standard practice for frames, the lads work off of the bracing components, not decking. So, I mean, to me, it's wholly unsafe anyway. But really, to answer your questions, Ilan, it's planning, and each job's different. I can't say that you plan differently for tube and coupler or system, because you're still planning against the event of the unforeseen. So it's a matter of having the input in the beginning to look at all your risks. Hope that answers your question.
Sure. All right.
Yep. Next slide. So currently in the UK, scaffold training follows the latest NASC safety guidance, and it complies with work at height regulation. This includes focusing on the training of scaffolders to recognise the dangers with regards working at height, what you've just spoke about. If we're training people how to work safely in a training centre, then they should recognise the dangers when they get out into what we call like the real world. But from the training point of view from the UK now, this includes teaching scaffolders to work from what we call a scaffolder's safe zone. So a scaffolder's safe zone would mitigate the risk of falls not only to people, but to loose objects. You can see on the images on the left that the scaffolders are working fully boarded platform with a toe board installed at the earliest opportunity. So with tube and coupler, if loose tubes or fittings are placed on the boards, that can be inadvertently kicked by the scaffolder accidentally, and then it can slide off, and then it could become a falling object. So we teach people to work off fully boarded platforms and install toe boards right from the get-go. Next slide. As you can see, unfortunately, many countries don't work in this way, and they certainly don't train in this way. In a lot of places, climbing on steel tubes is still accepted as being acceptable when the scaffolder's wearing a harness. But to be honest, a harness has never stopped anybody falling. It only stops someone hitting the floor if they're attached at a sufficient distance above the floor to stop them from falling that distance. It won't stop anybody striking an object on the way down and receiving injury from that. And it certainly won't stop anybody letting go of something that they're holding in the event of a fall. You have to remember that no training can change a person's attitude in a couple of days or weeks. Site supervision must be on site to enforce that safe working methods are used. Personally, I believe it's very important that scaffolders are taught to follow the safest methods of work from the beginning to ensure safe practices are understood and complied with. I would say we have to remember that what is learnt in a training centre will be taken out into the workplace. Joe, can you pop up the next question, question 3? There's a poll question there, and looking at those images, what I would like people to do, and this isn't a right or wrong answer, this is me asking everybody watching a question. How many of you see scaffolders working like this? So they're working off of tubes. They might be attached with a harness, but now it depends what they're attached to. And a lot of the time I see people attached to a upright scaffold tube, and then what I've seen them do is put a scaffold coupler on the upright tube and slide the attachment down so it sits on the fitting. The attachments for the harness are not designed to work sideways. They're only designed to work in a straight pull straight down. So as soon as you put transverse bending moment on that hook, it's going to snap. So when I look at people being taught to put a fitting on an upright standard and slide the hook down, to me that just becomes so wrong. But that's a different subject. We're looking at dropped objects. So Joe, what was the answer? There was only 2 options there, so yes or no.
It's pretty conclusive, Jeff. I think some people in the chat, Mark is also saying, yeah, he hardly sees anything different than this. So yeah.
So 84% of people see this being followed around the world every day. So I'm not pointing a finger at any country. And I'll be honest with you, this happens in the United Kingdom as well. the difference in the United Kingdom, the lads doing it know that if they get caught by the HSE, which is the equivalent of DOSH in Malaysia, or the local health and safety executive, if they get caught, they can find themselves taken to court, and they can be prosecuted and fined vast amounts of money, a lot more than they earn. So 84% have said that they think it's wrong. So the next question I'd like you to pop up, Joe, is going to be, how many people think that this is acceptable, or how many people think it's unsafe? So again, no right or wrong answer, just put an honest answer there. Do you think this is acceptable, or do you think it's unacceptable? As I said, if someone's holding something and they lose their footing, the first thing they're going to do is let go of whatever they're holding to save themselves, and they're not going to care who's underneath them or what they're working over that they drop that item onto and the damage it causes or the risk of injury. All they're going to look out for is themselves, and that's human nature. So what was, again, it's a quick one. I don't think we need to give this 5 minutes, but
no, that's right. So it's again pretty clear, but perhaps you can also answer, Jeff. I'm guessing you've got some people in your training who say this is acceptable, and how do you change their mind?
We're back to that thing that I started at the beginning. It comes down to attitude. If I've got to ask someone a question, and if they think it's acceptable, how much do they care about the people that they're working over, or the safety of the guys that they're asking to work in such a way? And to me, if anybody says this is acceptable, then I personally, in the United Kingdom, I would not sign them off as being a competent person, because they're telling me that they don't care about their own safety or the safety of anybody else. But that's my opinion. In the training in the UK, work like this is actually illegal. So it's not only unsafe, it is illegal. Can we pop to the next slide? So having said all of that, as much as I believe in good training to ensure people are aware of the hazards and the risk, there's always going to be some hazards that come with products. When we're using conventional tube and coupler scaffolding, there's always going to be a gap, as shown in this picture, where standards protrude through the decks. That's going to leave a gap of 50 millimeters. As we've said, every job's going to require a hazard assessment or risk assessment. And if a risk assessment identifies that the hazard or risk of items falling through this gap is unacceptable, then this gap needs to be closed. This can be done by using plywood, but by fixing plywood to that scaffold, it can now cause other problems. If we use plywood that's too thin, when someone treads on it, it can break. If we use plywood that's too thick, it can now become a tripping hazard. Plus, we have to consider the additional weight, time, the cost of cutting and fixing down all the materials to put that plywood over the gap. And it can also involve bringing another trade onto the job, as it could require the use of a carpenter. And again, while the carpenter's installing it, there's the risk of him dropping nails, plywood or hammers through that gap. If we can go to the next slide. There's products on the market now for multiple reasons which will prevent hazards from occurring. But to be honest, as simple as it is to put things into place to overcome a hazard, it's better to try and put a scaffold into place in the first place that eliminates the hazard. Because of this gap in system, or in a conventional scaffolding, system scaffold has become preferred in a lot of instances, because, like we said, there's the reduced number of loose items, so there's less chances of items being dropped. If we can go to the next slide. However, not all systems are able to close boards fully because of bracing. and therefore we might end up even using a system scaffold that leaves the same inherent hazard or risk that we've already identified. Obviously, this isn't something that scaffold manufacturers will want to advertise. So again, if this is something on your sites you're looking at, you need to do your research to make sure that such gaps are dealt with by the manufacturer and are eliminated. If we can flip to the next slide, Zylan. There are products on the market that close the platforms completely, but it's also worth considering that when a scaffolder is installing any scaffold, there's going to be the inherent risk for the installation of the components whilst the scaffold is potentially restricted due to the movements of a harness. Sometimes to install components, this can lead to working without suitable edge protection or working platforms. Some system manufacturers actually promote assembly methods that leave items temporarily unsecured in position, therefore exposing those items to becoming a dropped object until they're set into place. Many modular systems need additional measures to secure decks, and as such, when we're putting decking down into place, we might end up using wire bonds, which in themselves, if they're not installed properly, can become tripping hazards. Or they may need manually operated locking tabs, which can be overlooked or forgotten, and then that can lead to potentially unsecured decking that can become a major drops hazard if it's displaced by wind or other unexpected uplift. Securing the decks is often overlooked, especially with conventional scaffolding, as this requires the introduction of board retaining clamps or BRCs, and as we said, potentially the use of wire bonds. Short bolts are often accidentally displaced because they're not locked down. Can we go to the next slide? So there's multitudes of items that we can purchase or install on the scaffolding to protect the scaffolders and people under the scaffold from the risk of dropped objects or kicked objects. Staircases don't necessarily need toe boards as shown in this image on the side. This is a picture from a job by Shell, and Shell said they did a risk assessment and they found that somebody coming down the stairs could lose a footing and their foot could slide out under the handrail and they could drop objects that could go under the handrail. So they insisted on toe boards on the staircase. Plastic brick guards, they get used on scaffolding. They can either clip to the handrail, they can be fixed onto floor slab edges on scaffold handrails. You can even get brick guards now that bolt to the floor slab itself, so they can be used on buildings. Debris netting and plastic sheeting can be put on the outside of scaffolding to contain any materials within the footprint of the scaffold. But again, now we've got other risks that we have to look at, the wind loading that's going to be subjected to the scaffold because of the enlarged surface area. In the UK, shrink wrap is now becoming a popular choice to contain materials within the scaffolding footprint. Shrink wrap is really tidy, especially on system scaffolds. You don't get materials falling out, and it's very tight to the scaffold, so it really does become good to stop loose objects. Next slide. Again, we're looking at the use of proprietary objects now to stop materials from falling. Plugs and end caps, these can be used now for putting on the end of scaffold tubes. The plugs, they push internally into a scaffold tube and they're really difficult to get out once they're in. They do limit the ability to join scaffolds end to end. The internal spigot connections are no longer able to be used. End caps, the disadvantage, I guess, with them is they're very easy to take off and put back on again, but both of them can stop idiots putting loose items into scaffold tubes, which when the scaffold's being dismantled can become a projectile. So again, these I think are a simple solution to what is ultimately a very common problem. Next slide. As we get into the more modern world, now tethers are becoming something that's becoming more and more used, I would say, in the scaffolding industry. They're still relatively new in the big scheme of things, but they do allow people to attach tools to themselves. So if they drop a tool, it can only go as far as the tether. Now in England, they're starting to promote the use of tethers for fittings. And there's pictures there that show fittings being tethered and put into place. On the real high-rise stuff in London, because of one of the questions that Zylan popped out earlier with the distance the projectile can travel, this is something now that's being used on a lot of jobs in London, especially on the high-rise, where you've got a lot of people underneath where work that's going on, and then obviously they're exposed to the risk of falling objects. From a practical standpoint, construction companies and scaffold companies have to realize that this is going to slow the job down inexplicably, and additional time has to be put into place. Another place of work where these become highly popular is in the aircraft industry. If scaffolds are being erected over aircraft, if a scaffold fitting was dropped onto a Boeing 777, obviously the cost of x-rays or ensuring that the aircraft's safe to fly is going to run into the thousands of dollars. So therefore the use of these safety measures, it's immaterial really, the cost against the risk. As we said, it's very time consuming, and as such scaffolders must be allowed the additional time. Safety is now becoming embedded in values where companies now constantly strive to find safe way to protect the safety of their employees, their site workers and the general public. The use of closable lift sacks that will not deteriorate in UV sunlight are now being used for raising and lowering scaffold materials. I couldn't find a picture of the bags, but I know in England they have ones with industrial zips or poppers in the top, so you can actually lock the bag up. Joe was talking about ones with Velcro straps on pouches, but again, this is going to slow the job down. So when people are pricing, this is something safety-wise that has to be costed. If people don't take a cost of the account of this cost, then it's something that gets dropped really quick by the scaffolders, especially if they're the ones that are suffering financially. All the products on the market that are now available to reduce dropped objects, in my opinion, are secondary. As with any risk, the first thing we should do is eliminate the risk. So if we can't eliminate it, the next thing we've got to do is plan to work around it. So training, in my opinion, training is the best tool for removing the dropped objects that we face on site. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I think we're back where we started. So at this point, I'd like to wrap up and just say thanks to everyone for listening. If anyone's got questions, please use the Q&A, and then we can have a question and answer session, open discussion afterwards. If anybody wants to contact me or link with me on LinkedIn, they can. My name's Jeff Mulligan. It's shown up there. Just find me on LinkedIn, or my email address at perryapac.com. You can write to me there, and I will do my best to answer anybody's questions or comments as soon as practically possible. Joe, thanks for inviting me. I hope this has been beneficial and helpful to everyone, but I'm going to hand it back to you, and let's hope there's some good questions.
Yeah, there are...
Sorry, Zylan, if you just give me a minute before we go into the Q&A. Thanks, right. Thanks very much. Yeah, so thanks very much, Jeff. I think that was really very interesting, very approach specific to scaffolding, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions. So please keep them coming, and Zylan will facilitate that in a bit. So, but before that, go over a few things first. So after the Q&A session, we'll be transitioning to the virtual networking reception. This will be outside of Zoom in our Jobs Forum application, and you'll see the link here on your screen. If you can install it on your PC, that's the best thing. But if you're not allowed by your IT department to do so, I would recommend you use the mobile version. So after downloading, you may log in using your Apple ID or Google ID or a LinkedIn account to log into the application, and then you can meet with the speakers and other delegates from the meeting. So I'd like to express my thanks to our sponsors. First of all, Stop Drop Tooling and DropSafe. So DropSafe creates solutions to prevent dropped objects falling from height. They've just launched a new product called the TriSafe Carabiner. So, you know, while we are talking about competency and training, of course, DropSafe takes a slightly different but definitely complementary approach by engineering solutions that kind of, you know, compensate for perhaps the bad behaviors of personnel, and this is kind of something we like to do in the drops community, come up with lots of solutions, but on top of that, of course, the training and competency that Jeff proposes. Similarly, Stop Drop Tooling provides complete engineered solutions for tools with working at heights. So when the regulations Jeff mentioned came into effect in the UK, scaffolding companies reported up to 15% reduction in productivity from just having to tie off their tools. And Stop Drop worked very closely with scaffolding companies to engineer various solutions to improve the ergonomics while maintaining the safety. So here it is on their website. So with that commercial intermission, I would like to hand it over back to Zailan, who will facilitate the Q&A session. Thanks very much, Zailan.
Thank you, Joe. Indeed, I received quite numbers of questions, and I believe that some of the question has been answered by Geoff earlier. But then again, if we happen to have time, we will re-explain back, especially on certain practice, because we believe that there are questions raised from India, from Indonesia, so we have got a different practice and so on. Questions such as highlighted by Pak Zakri just now from Indonesia, the parameters of the isolation barriers requirements is already defined by Mr. Job. So I believe that the answer is there. But then again, if you believe that or you like to raise up further understanding on that, maybe you know the contact number of Mr. Job. You can explain it later. But we need to have like another 4 to 5 more questions. One from Mr. Mark highlighted on the primary and secondary protections. It seems to be norm to see this in oil and gas, but in the constructions wise, it's a big question mark. So is there any such requirement or mandatory to have primary and secondary protection? Mr. Geoff, please.
With the construction industry, they're going to follow local legislation. So as you pointed out rightly just now, Zailan, different countries have different local legislations. In the working at height regs, which is the regulation we follow in the UK, there is no parameters for what I would call secondary measures. It says that each job has got the need for an individual risk assessment, which will then highlight each individual risk, and then it will put into place measures of work that will then either eliminate. If it can't eliminate, it will then start stepping down through the usual methods of control for a hazard. So again, if you can't eliminate the hazard, then you have to start looking at using objects or methods of protection. So this is coming right in with what Joe was promoting earlier. Personally, with the oil and gas industry, if the oil and gas industry starts putting in secondary measures, from my experience with oil and gas, they will look at every aspect, every angle, and they will go to the absolute extreme, and cost doesn't really come into it. They would rather eliminate the event in the first place. So to be honest, I can't say that there's anything in legislation that I'm personally aware of which has primary or secondary measures. It's a risk assessment and then a method statement following the risk assessment.
All right, thank you very much, guys. So I believe that the answer is quite clear. So it depends very much on your perspective, legal requirements in your country, and based on the risk assessment. If you find that the risk assessment required you to have a secondary protections, then by hook or by you need to get it done. All right. So thank you for that. I believe that Mr. Kenny highlighted the question, a few of them actually, on the tethering tools, tethered tools. Is it compulsory nowadays? And what is your advice regarding this?
There's no law that says tools need to be tethered. But we're back to that same scenario that it's down to a risk assessment. If the risk assessment has highlighted the use of tethers as a way of eliminating that risk becoming an accident or an event, then it now becomes compulsory that the scaffolders use the tethers as is stated in the risk assessment or method statement, and then comply with it. So again, it's totally dependent on a risk assessment. So if I'm going to repeat myself, if the risk assessment says it's mandatory, it is mandatory. It is no law that says tools have to be tethered.
All right, thank you. Quite clear on that. And I believe that the organizers do have the way of supplying good tools. I believe they can use that. Okay, Mr. Muhammad highlight that in his opinion that in scaffold, so it is good to have protection against edges of the pipes, the fittings just now we are talking about, and especially to the congested area. Again, is it mandatory to have such thing, or what is the normal practice to do that?
It is best practice to use them. They're so common now. They're not new. They've been around for 20, 30 years, maybe longer. They're not expensive. Most scaffold companies now have hundreds, if not thousands of these things kicking around in their yards. Most scaffold manufacturers make their own with their logos on them, and they'll supply them at very little additional cost. Yes, it is, as pointed out, against protection to the public, but the biggest risk that I've encountered is people like welders, when they have the welding rod, when they're finished with it, if they're looking for somewhere to put it, they'll poke it down the end of the scaffold tube. In my experience, in 41 years of working, I've seen broom handles poked into scaffold tubes. And let me tell you, as a scaffolder, you don't stop and look down every single scaffold tube to make sure someone hasn't put something into it. When it comes to dismantling the scaffold, you take the scaffold tube down, you pass it over the side of the scaffold if it's being manually handled, or you tie it on and lower it. And that can be the first time that you realize something's going to come flying out the tube. So as I said in my presentation, it stops idiots, and that's all I can call them, people that poke loose items up the ends of scaffold tubes. And yes, it's good to stop pedestrians and people catching their clothing, but oh boy, the plugs, they really do stop people poking things up, and they're nigh on impossible to get out once they're in. So
all right, thanks Joe. Really interesting answer. But then again, we've seen quite numbers of incidents that happen to the publics because of this practice, but same if you notice in Malaysia also as well, it's not become mandatory. It's a good practice that related to the publics. You have another additional protections. Okay, I have one question from anonymous attendee for the how to check the fall protection equipment, which is, I believe that this question can be answered later on, because it's how to inspect the fall protection equipment, harness,
that's
and
a different
skill.
question.
I'll
answer questions like that on
right. So I'll skip on that. Just highlighted to the clouds.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I got one question from Mr. JP here. Pictorial scenario based on workflow to educate scaffolding personnel that may provide not just during training education, but can be guidelines for continuing improvements. Any plan on such product in near future? What do you mean by that?
In what country? Because again, each country is going to have its own. It's always going to have its own plans. I mean, in the United Kingdom, toolbox talks are now a mandatory part of day-to-day conduct on most sites, and small items where we discuss stuff like this can be reminded to scaffolders daily. In the UK, once you've attended a toolbox talk, the scaffolder has to sign a document to say that he attended the toolbox talk and these items were addressed. And then if he goes on and does something which is then highlighted in the toolbox talk as being negative or bad practice, he's now leaving himself open to termination or prosecution as a result of his actions. Right. So whether that's coming to the country where these people are asking, I can't answer.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe it's related to the training method or training guidelines that they're using, because again, if you look at the different countries have their own ways of how to call themselves as competency. Some people take 10 days, some people take 8 days and 5 days also as well. So, I do agree with you, Jeff. Is there any more questions? Language barrier can be an uphill task. Pictorial scenario, yes. Pictorial based training will be great, no doubt with that. Yep, thank you. So I believe that's all. That's all of the questions.
Excellent. Right. Well, we're coming to the end of the hour as well. So, wow, lots of questions. I also really like how everyone engaged on the chat. I saw there's some really good feedback as well. If you're just hearing this, you know, the chat, read through. There's some really good comments from the audience as well. Now, unfortunately, you know, we can talk about this all day, but I think we had captured it quite nicely in this hour. So. This, as mentioned, this session is recorded. So if you came in halfway during the session, we'll be posting this on YouTube. You may refer it to it at a later stage, or perhaps share it with some colleagues that you might like them to see it. So thanks very much, Jeff, for all these insights. And Zailan. Yeah,
Joe, sorry to interrupt. There are people asking whether they like to have the copy of the slides. Is that possible? And how to give it to them? By emails or whatsoever?
To be honest, I'm the one who created the slides. A lot of them are owned by training providers. And if I was to give copies out, which then went viral, I would end up answering some awkward questions. So unfortunately, no. And as Joe said, if the presentation's available on Zoom online, you can always go back and see it again on there. But no, I won't be giving the slides out to anybody for copyright. I cannot.
Okay.
Yeah. No. So with that, thanks again, Jeff. Thanks very much, Zailan, for facilitating the questions. I think there was a lot coming in, so expertly done. Thanks very much. I think, Zailan, you've put your contact details in the chat as well. If not, please do again. And then people can reach out to you if they have any questions, or they can reach out to me, and then I'll connect you, and the same for Jeff, of course. So with that, this webinar is coming to an end. As mentioned earlier, we'll be transitioning to the networking reception, which is in the virtual app. You need to download that to your computer or mobile phone. And then we'll be able to have a chat there one-on-one. Any last words before we go, Jeff?
No, I think I mean, like I said, if people want to ask me questions, my contact's on LinkedIn, or it's at the start and the end of this presentation. I'm more than happy to answer people's questions or concerns in regards to UK scaffold training. And as Ilan rightly pointed out, every country has their own requirements for training. So I can't say that anyone is better than anyone else's. But I've got my beliefs, and I'm sure everybody listening has got their own as well. But yeah, contact me and I'll be happy to answer my opinion on anyone's questions. Or if they've got technical questions, if I don't know the answer, I will certainly find it and get back to them.
Excellent. And Zylan, any final words before we go?
Yeah, thank you very much for giving us such opportunity. But then again, scaffolding or preventing drop object is so crucial that everyone really need to look at that. Before you can start, stop, look around, identify, and take action promptly, because learning from accident is very painful.
Excellent, excellent. Well said, Zylan. So I'm going to close the webinar now. As it closes, you'll be taken to a website with a short survey. It will just take 2 minutes. Please answer the questions, and then we have some good feedback for this webinar so we can improve for the next time. Thanks very much. Have a great day and see you in the networking app.
All right, stay safe, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.